Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Rob Blair. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science and the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University, and I'm also the coordinator of the Democratic Erosion Consortium. I'm here with Emily Clow from Northeastern University and John Sheeman from Fairleigh Dickinson University, who will be co-moderating this virtual roundtable on race, ethnicity, and democratic erosion in comparative perspective. We are delighted that so many of you could join us. So this roundtable was organized through the Democratic Erosion Consortium, which is a network of over 50 universities in the US, UK, Ireland, Israel, Turkey, Romania, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines. And as a consortium, our goal is to combine teaching and research and the civic and policy engagement to help our students and faculty better understand threats to democracy in the US and abroad, and better address those threats through our work as students and educators and citizens. Our members run the gamut from small liberal arts colleges to large public research universities. And one of the centerpieces of the consortium is a course on democratic erosion that is taught at dozens of campuses every semester. I know many of you in the audience today are either teaching or are enrolled in that course this spring. Our faculty also use the consortium as a vehicle for producing research, for example, an ongoing impact evaluation designed to test strategies for reducing partisan polarization among American youths. We also use the consortium as a mechanism for engaging the policy community, including USAID, the US State Department, the National Democratic Institute, and a variety of other organizations. This is the third virtual roundtable that we've organized through the consortium over the past academic year. They've been really terrific. I have no doubt that this one will be as well. And if you are an educator and are interested in joining the consortium, I hope you'll please email me or visit our website, democratic-erosion.com. Okay, so now I'm going to turn the virtual mic over to Emily and John to introduce our panelists.
Thank you for that introduction, Rob, and welcome everyone. I want to particularly thank our panelists for being here today. We're all in for a really fascinating conversation. So just to give you a sense of why we're doing this panel, what the topic is, right? In our course on democratic erosion within the consortium, we've learned a lot about the role that polarization on the one hand and things like populism can play as precursors to democratic erosion. Right? And we know that at least in some cases, polarizing or populist rhetoric can fall along racial or ethnic lines. We've also seen research about in a number of instances in which democracy was particularly fragile and polarization was high in the United States. The US has sort of come back from the brink by taking racial equity off the table. And so these themes of democratic erosion on the one hand and kind of racial politics and ethnic politics on the other seem kind of inextricably linked in interesting ways in the United States case. We also have scholarship on similar themes in other country contexts. And we have incredible scholarship research done by scholars of race and ethnic politics who work on a variety of regime types, including a number of democracies from all over the world. But oftentimes the scholars of race and ethnic politics in the United States aren't in the same room necessarily as the scholars of race and ethnic politics in comparative politics. And so we thought this would be an amazing opportunity to bring all of these folks together and have a conversation, a kind of comparative conversation about how racial and ethnic politics shape democracy and democratic erosion in a variety of contexts, to see what we can discover about kind of commonalities and differences across these different contexts. So we're thrilled to have the panelists here today, and now we're going to introduce them one by one. So first, we have with us Dr. Hakeem Jefferson. Dr. Jefferson is an assistant professor of political science at Stanford University. His research focuses on the role identity plays in structuring political attitudes and behaviors in the US, and particularly on how stigma shapes the politics of Black Americans. We also have with us Dr. Kamuli Kasara. Dr. Kasara is an associate professor of political science at Columbia University. And she studies ethnic demography, political violence, and distributive politics in the African context. Her current research is on how economic and demographic change affect politicians' responses to ethnic and economic heterogeneity historically, worldwide, as well as in post-independence Africa.
All right, first I just want to join Emily in welcoming both our panelists and our audience. I'm grateful for everybody for coming. Let me continue with the introductions with Dr. Marcus Johnson, an assistant professor of political science at City University of New York and Baruch College. And he specializes in ethnicity, race, and electoral politics in the Americas. His current work seeks to explain the conspicuous absence of racial appeals to voters in Latin America, despite the social salience of Black identity in the region. We also have with us Murat Summer, who's professor of political science and international relations at Koç University in Istanbul, and he specializes in comparative politics and political economy. His research addresses questions of democratization, autocratization, social and political polarization, ethnic conflicts, nationalism, and religious and secular politics. And I'll also add, he is a participating member of the Democratic Erosion Consortium, not this particular semester, but he teaches in the program. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Pavitra Suryanarayan, who is an assistant professor at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Her research is motivated by the desire to understand how different forms of group-based inequality, class, status, race, ethnicity perhaps, shape political behavior and institutions in multi-ethnic countries like India and the United States. So welcome to all of you. What I want to do now is say just a little bit about the format for everybody. So we'll start by inviting each of our panelists to share 8 minutes of remarks about the relationship between race and ethnic politics on the one hand and democratic erosion in the countries that they're most familiar with. And then we'll read out some questions from students in the democratic erosion courses. When we do that, we'll open up the floor for about 5 minutes after each question and invite all of our panelists to respond to the questions. If there's any remaining time at the end, we'll invite our audience to submit questions via the chat, and we'll be collecting those and perhaps combining them in some cases. So with that, let me then ask Hakeem to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for having us. I'm eager for this conversation. And I've been thinking a lot about Georgia, and so I thought I'd frame my remarks today in relation to what happened recently in Georgia. So for those of you unfamiliar, 5 days ago, Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, signed into law sweeping reform of the state's election laws. Sitting in front of a painting of a plantation surrounded by a group of all white men as a Black woman, a state legislator, was arrested for knocking on the door of the room where the bill was signed in a private ceremony. Governor Kemp did what many of his predecessors had done before him. In response to displays of Black political power in Georgia in recent years, highlighted by Stacey Abrams' razor-thin loss in 2018, Joe Biden's victory in the state in the 2020 presidential election, and the election of 2 Democrats, Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, to the US Senate, Republicans in the state have set out to burden and restrict access to the ballot. So here's what the so-called Election Integrity Act of 2021, passed in Georgia, here's what it does. It requires ID verification to vote by mail and cuts the amount of time voters have to request a mail-in ballot by half, from 180 days to 77 days before an election. And after learning how effective absentee ballot drop boxes were during the 2020 election, the state legislature has decided to undermine their utility by moving them inside early voting sites, meaning the drop boxes will only be available during early voting days and hours instead of 24/7. A rule undoubtedly meant to target low-income residents of color who often work multiple jobs and benefit from having unfettered access to ballot drop boxes. The law also gives state officials new power to take control of local election boards, a tactic Republican lawmakers can use to usurp power from duly elected local officials who failed to deliver the results they want. And of course, as many of you have now heard, the law makes it illegal for third-party organizations to provide food and water to voters standing in line to vote. Now, why would Republicans in Georgia add such a strange and brazenly inhumane feature to this bill, which they claim is just meant to increase confidence in the electoral process? Well, Republicans in Georgia understand that Black voters in their state are disproportionately burdened by long lines. according to data analyzed by my colleague Jonathan Roden here at Stanford, in the June primary in Georgia, the average wait time after 7 p.m. across the state was 51 minutes in polling places that were 90% or more non-white, but only 6 minutes in polling places that were 90% white. Republicans in Georgia also know that many Black organizations, including Black fraternities and sororities, make it a point to provide food and water to those waiting in line as a means of encouraging them to stay in place and vote, even if they have to wait an inordinately long time to cast their ballot. And it was only after national outrage that Georgia Republicans backed off a proposal to virtually eliminate Sunday voting, a move that would have undermined a long-standing tradition in the Black community known as Souls to the Polls, where Black churchgoers cast their ballots after attending Sunday service. I'm talking about Georgia today in this conversation because I think that it is ground zero for attacks on America's multiracial democracy. In response to the showing of Black political power, states across the country are moving to restrict or burden access to the ballot. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, a public policy institute and advocacy organization here in the US, state legislators have introduced 3 times the number of bills to restrict voting access as compared to this time last year. 28 states have introduced, pre-filed, or carried over 106 restrictive bills this year. And like the law passed in Georgia, these laws set out to limit male voting access. They impose stricter voter ID requirements. They set out to limit successful pro-voter registration policies and enable state officials to more aggressively purge voters from voter rolls. And they do all of this knowing that the Supreme Court, which took the teeth out of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, will stand by and do nothing as they attack voting rights for racial and ethnic minorities. It is not hyperbole to note that the future of a multiracial democracy in America hangs in the balance. Left to their own devices, white Republican elites with the support of their constituents continue to find new ways to make it harder for people of color and Black people especially to vote. This is, I think, a moment of crisis for American democracy, one that is deeply rooted in legacies of white racism and the desire among some members of the public and various political elites to maintain white rule and the myth of white supremacy. For lest we forget, as my friend Rob Mickey documents in his important book, Paths Out of Dixie, authoritarian, anti-democratic enclaves persisted across the American South until the early 1970s. Making this point, Mickey reminds us that American democracy is relatively young. That is, if we take seriously that liberal democracy requires an extension of the franchise to all adult members of society. So I suppose the question is, what do we do about all of this? And I haven't even made mention of other threats to American democracy that are inextricably bound up with race and racism, notably the frequency with which Black Americans are killed by agents of the state who act with impunity, or the spate of racial violence that burdens the lives of racial and ethnic minorities across the United States. I don't think I have quite an answer to this big question, and hopefully we'll get to this in the conversation today. But this much I do know. This is not a drill. American democracy, a multiracial democracy, is on life support. And saving it will require that people of goodwill and the elected officials who represent them act with urgency to save it. Because this much too is clear. There are many white Republicans in this country who stand ready to pull the plug on these efforts. So I'll stop there, and I'm eager for the conversation.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Hakeem. I'm going to turn the floor over to Kamui now.
Yes, thank you so much for organizing this panel and for inviting me. I don't quite know how I'm going to follow Hakeem in terms of sort of the importance and the eloquence of what he had to say. So I'm going to try to bring an Africanist perspective to this question of ethnic polarization and democratic erosion. I'm going to talk less about race because it's, I mean, even though race is a salient identity in many Sub-Saharan African countries, ethnic polarization and democratic erosion are more closely connected. I may, if I have time, talk about the parallels with apartheid South Africa and what is happening in the United States today. So, you know, I haven't really been, though I've been thinking about ethnicity and ethnic polarization and democracy as an Africanist, I've not really been engaging with polarization. And so my headline remarks are going to be the following, that, you know, I feel like I'm in this panel being asked to draw a bright line between ethnic polarization, populism, and democratic erosion, where ethnic polarization is this new thing, right? But ethnic politics has always been the dominant form that politics takes in Sub-Saharan Africa. And instead, the things that, you know, currently in contemporary Africa today that look like populism are actually the consequence of the fact that certain constituencies, particularly the urban poor, have moved away from finding ethnic appeals particularly interesting. I'm going to make that more clear in a second. So, you know, just what are the points about sort of the way the discipline has gone? So when I first started studying African politics, there was very much a frame of mind that ethnicity was, you know, or ethnic politics were sort of a developing world phenomenon. And that places like the United States, even though most people understood that democracy was more available to some Americans, was more real for some Americans rather than others. I think there's a growing and very welcome consensus in the discipline that, you know, as Hakeem has said, the United States is actually quite a new democracy. And, you know, so why does ethnic polarization make democracy hard to sustain, in my view? So first is, you know, people might find difficulty in compromising over policies that require cultural difference. The second reason might be that, you know, there's something about, you know, how cultural differences make it difficult for us to coordinate opposition to democratic erosion. And the third is that if people are unwilling to vote for people outside their own ethnic group, if elections become an ethnic census, then some groups are going to be in a permanent minority the entire time, and those groups will become much more willing to accept erosions of democracy, dictatorships that govern for them rather than other people. And in Sub-Saharan Africa, really, even though we've talked about democratic erosion since 2010, the initial period of democratic erosion was upon independence. You know, almost all African countries achieved independence in the 1960s and 70s as democracies. And within by the end of the decade, by the 1970s, only 2 of those countries continued to remain democracies. And ethnic polarization is very much a big part of that story. And, you know, ethnic politics becomes salient. There's many reasons ethnic politics is salient in Sub-Saharan Africa, but the political economy of ethnic politics is quite simple. The things that people demand from the government are chiefly local public goods, right? Wells, schools, roads, and only some, and they can only be in one place rather than another. So the political economy underpinning of ethnic politics or ethnic party organization, but according to people like Bob Bates and others, is, you know, is regional in nature as much as anything else. And so let's just move from history to think about democratic erosion in Sub-Saharan Africa in the past 5 or 10 years. And I know you've been reading about Zambia. There's a case of Tanzania that's salient in the news right now. But really, most recent democratic erosion in Sub-Saharan Africa isn't really to do with any new emergent ethnic cleavage or willingness to sort of mobilize along ethnic lines. It's more to do with things like deterring security in face of extremism, making people much more willing to accept autocratic governments. It's more to do with authoritarian international forces, the involvement of China and to a lesser extent Russia in providing aid in Sub-Saharan Africa, and in general international indifference to whether or not African countries even pretend to be democratic. So the democratic erosion that has occurred recently, to my mind, is less about, you know, ethnic polarization in politics. The case that I think is the one that would be most interesting, so those of you who want to think about race and democratic erosion, is the case of South Africa. Because, you know, the introduction of apartheid in South Africa has, you know, this also sounds like hyperbole to say, but it has really clear parallels between what's happening now in the United States, right? So, you know, the National Party runs and wins on a mandate of apartheid, basically, you know, trying to retain an economy that sort of benefits the 20% of the population that's the white minority. A scheme of labor repression that essentially means that, Black labor, repression makes white lifestyles greater. And the National Party wins by a narrow majority in 1937. And it's a surprise. And they don't even win the popular vote, right? And then there's a series of reforms that they introduce. One, they take the vote away from non-white people in a particular province who had the vote. There's also constitutional, they benefit from gerrymandering, and they enhance gerrymandering to get their policies through. And they also sort of increase the size of various electoral bodies to make to create a false consensus for these apartheid policies, which many whites just thought were kind of, maybe not undesirable, but certainly unimplementable, right? They explicitly campaign on what they call the Zwart Gevaar, which is the Black danger, the Black peril, right? It's and so, before anybody knew what was happening, apartheid is firmly entrenched in Sub-Saharan Africa, and in South Africa, and it's very much a scheme of welfare chauvinism. Like, white South Africans benefit from a very robust welfare state, right? And then, but moving from the case that I think looks closer to the cases that you're interested in, what does populism look like in Sub-Saharan Africa today? So here I'm drawing on the work of Danielle Resnick, who is a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute. She wrote a great book called Urban Poverty and Party Populism in African Democracies. And she makes 3 points, which I think illuminate what populism looks like in Sub-Saharan Africa, or some version of it, right? And it's consistent, at least in the contemporary period, with democracy or democratic elections. So the first thing is it's rarely exclusionary in the sense that it aims to speak for we the people. It's not welfare chauvinism. Instead, it's used by charismatic politicians to build a constituency amongst the urban poor, right? And this is possible because of really high rates of urbanization in Sub-Saharan Africa and the youth bulge. It's a very, very young continent. The campaign style, is a style of charismatic leadership. There are these social cultural performances, speaking in vernacular languages, using modern music. And there's a focus on corruption and anti-elite politics. But at the same time, these politicians, because you need rural votes to win, also will campaign, in rural areas on ethnicity. And so basically, what looks closest to populism, at least stylistically, in Sub-Saharan Africa right now, exists because, because the basis of ethnic politics, the importance of ethnic politics in urban areas amongst the poor has declined. So that's a way in which I think Sub-Saharan Africa is different from the cases we can think about in Western Europe, say. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Kamuli. We now will hear from Marcus. Please take it away, Marcus.
Hi, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Kamuli and Hakeem for those comments. So I'm coming from the perspective of race and democratic erosion in Latin America, and I guess the first thing that I want to say up front is that I'm Black from the United States, but I study race in Latin America, and so in part, my understanding of race in Latin America is informed by my lens of being Black in the US, but also being Black and racialized in my fieldwork in Latin America. So, I think it's very interesting to be on a panel with folks from many different global regions, in part because Latin America for many decades was kind of left out of the conversation on ethnicity and race. Very recently, we've seen some really standout cases of ethnic and racial backlash. We can think back to 2019 when President Evo Morales was deposed very unceremoniously in what many then went on to debate whether this was a coup or not a coup. Certainly we saw in the aftermath of his deposal and in the politics leading up to that race and ethnicity were very much on the forefront of many of former President Morales's detractors. In particular, kind of this concern that Bolivia had drifted away from Christianity towards some sort of heathen or pagan faith under an indigenous president. In addition, it's hard to talk about race and backlash in Latin America without thinking about Jair Bolsonaro, elected to president in 2017 in Brazil on the heels of what it seemed like kind of a democratic opening, at least on race, under the presidencies of Dilma Rousseff and the PT. And so we can see very recently that we see some of this visibility of racial politics coming to the forefront. But to understand this fully, we have to kind of think about these evolutions that have occurred in Latin America over time. This is not anything new. And so first, it's important, to kind of look historically and think that Blackness and indigeneity have been central to state formation in Latin America from the time the Spaniards arrived and began their project of colonization and exploitation. And so Latin America was actually the practicer of chattel slavery in the Americas. And so, kind of taking into consideration that 80% of enslaved Africans that were brought through the Middle Passage ended up in the Latin American Caribbean and the landmass of South America. Also noting that indigenous labor exploitation was very much central to the state building project in the colonial era and continuing into the contemporary era. And so we can note that Blackness and indigeneity have always been a part of the fabric of state making in the region. What is important to note, however, is that the ideology around race and around identity was very much kind of rooted in an idea of colorblindness, especially beginning in the 20th century, as Latin American states really began to focus on consolidating national identities. There was a concerted effort to reduce the language, but also the statistical documentation and recognition of racial difference. And so for about a decade or so, there weren't really censuses that tabulated the Black populations or the indigenous populations, which led to lots of assumptions that race just didn't exist. Underneath that, however, especially from work from sociologists like Mara Loveman, Tiana Pichel, Eddie Tellez, we see that there was kind of a building of a structure of racial hierarchy reinforced through this narrative of colorblindness. And so we kind of have emerged since the 1980s and 1990s into a period of relative race visibility through many different reforms that have taken different types of different forms across different countries. But notably, we see an increased visibility in policy of Black and Indigenous communities, censuses that now document the size and condition of these populations, laws that are kind of explicitly designed around anti-discrimination, land reforms that are specifically granted to Black communities, and affirmative action in places like Brazil and Colombia. And so we've really kind of seen this shift from colorblindness to maybe colorfulness in the state's recognition of racial difference. And this isn't something that happened out of the goodwill of states necessarily, but this was part of a project of a global human rights regime that was consolidating around cultural visibility, group rights, group difference, at the same time that many Latin American states and constitutions were in crisis. So this became kind of a way to gain legitimacy, to create spaces for marginalized groups within the state. Now, and Tiana Pichel, Juliet Hooker, a democratic theorist and political scientist at Brown, worked on this really and powerful edited volume documenting the current moment that we're in, which is a response to this multicultural citizenship reform, which is this politics of backlash. Today, we're talking about it as democratic erosion. And so we can kind of see the evolution over time of race and exploitation at the center of state making in Latin America. It's gone through periods of invisibility, visibility, and now to backlash. And so, I think one thing would be helpful in part to help distinguish Latin America a bit is to focus on the distinction between what explicitly is talked about as race politics, explicitly talked about as racial backlash, versus what we can see more as structural elements of backlash or erosion. So we can talk about Jair Bolsonaro, we can talk about the coup in Bolivia, we can talk about other places like Chile where indigenous groups have been kind of labeled as terrorists as examples of kind of the explicit rhetoric of race and backlash. But we can also look to cases like Colombia, where the ongoing civil conflict has disproportionately affected Black and Indigenous communities in terms of the numbers of internally displaced persons and people killed in the conflict. And even after the peace accords were signed, the numbers of human rights activists, that Black and Indigenous, that have been murdered, even after the end of the civil conflict, so to speak, we see that this is racially concentrated. If we look to other cases as well, even before we get to the moment of democratization itself, the process of democratization has disproportionately impacted Black communities. I know I have about 1 minute, and I'll just kind of give an anecdote of this. In Panama, the case that I know best, in 1989, we kind of know this as the moment where the US invaded Panama, captured General Noriega, and then Panama emerged into democracy. What often isn't talked about is that the neighborhood in which Manuel Noriega was kind of holding shop was a predominantly Black neighborhood. And the US invaded with a disproportionate use of bombs, guns, and military force, and displaced and murdered unknown numbers of Afro-Panamanians in the process of opening up the doors to democracy. And so you can actually look this up. There's an international, or the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has condemned the US for committing war crimes. This ruling was passed in 2018, and the US kind of brushed it off, not really recognizing the jurisdiction of the court. But even at the moment of democratization, these moments that should have opened up politics for all peoples, we see that this happened disproportionately on the backs of Black citizens. And so, the kind of question that I'll leave off here is, I'm not sure that this is really so much democratic erosion as much as a continuation of a project of racial exploitation and marginalization and destruction.
Thank you for those remarks, Marcus. We'll turn the floor now over to Murat.
Thank you, Emily, and hi, everybody. So the question of the relationship between ethnic racial politics and democratic erosion. And when I ask this question to myself, then I also think about the follow-up question, which is, would it be possible to provide an answer, a historical answer general answer that would apply to different regions and different countries that we are interested in? I think it's often not possible, even though we can use a common approach to discover these different stories that apply to different regions and countries. In 1990s and early 2000s, however, the two dominant theoretical paradigms that tried to explain ethnic racial politics and their relation to democracy did try to provide an ahistorical answer devoid of human agency, and tried to explain ethnic politics, mostly ethnic politics that I know more about, is a byproduct of other things. It was either instrumentalism. People support ethnic politics because politicians use this as an instrument to get their support, and they fall for it. Or some kind of an essentialism that people are slaves of history, that there are these historically given identities, and as soon as these identities become the focus of politics, then they become very divisive and polarizing. I think these answers that were provided by political scientists and others were quite misleading. I think this relationship between ethnic politics and democracy was much more complex. Coming to 2010s and 2020s, I think we see a similar problem. I'm interested in polarizing politics, populism, and for a long time ethnic and religious politics as well. So when we try to explain populism in Europe or United States and racial politics as well, say ethnopopulism, for example, we say that, for example, political parties that lost support and relevance in societies, they resort to ethnic issues, racial issues, in order to mobilize people and become popular. That's one explanation that we come across. There is some truth to it. There is a close relationship between polarizing politics and ethnicity, because, and especially the kind of polarization that is dangerous for democracy, pernicious polarization. Because polarization becomes really dangerous for democracy when it becomes part of people's social identities. And when it also highly simplifies politics, and one cleavage really overrides all other cross-cutting cleavages. That is true, and ethnic divisions often have this potential. When used by politicians, they can be quite effective instrument. But I think we need better answers when we ask, for example, questions like, how come Hungarians who have very small Muslim minority and who have almost no Muslim migrants are so afraid of Muslim invasion of their countries, and that can become really a very powerful basis of the incumbent political party that also uses this popular support in order to erode checks and balances and other requirements of democracy. Can we understand why Hungarians support this kind of politics based on a simple conceptualization of rationality? That Hungarians simply have some kind of a preference, political preference that is related to race, ethnicity, or religion, and they automatically give their support to the incumbent party. It seems actually irrational, this kind of behavior of citizens that we see in so many countries. But I think it's more complex than that. In order to understand why, for example, Hungarians support this kind of politics, we need to understand the narratives that inform their fear, even in the absence of a real Muslim minority in their countries. There probably is some kind of a story, some kind of a narrative that makes sense in their minds, and that also motivate them to channel any kind of frustration, any kind of discontent that they have, which may be about a variety of different problems in their country. Often a fear of loss of sovereignty, for example, that is also an important basis of democracy in terms of some kind of in terms of this type of politics. At the end, let me also say a few words about ethnic politics, perhaps in the Balkans and Turkey as well. In order to understand the ethnic mobilization as well as nationalism in those countries, often we need to go to post-imperial nation building. Again, we come across similar puzzling stories here. For example, the Kurdish conflict is a long protracted conflict in Turkey. When it comes to understanding the concerns and fears of the Kurdish minority, I think it's much easier to understand. During the Turkish nation building, post-imperial nation building, the builders of the state, they tried to create a common identity, and this common identity that they were able to construct at that time excluded the Kurdish identity. And Kurds are also devoid of many minority rights, such as education in their mother tongue. The constitution doesn't mention their name, so on and so forth. It is a much more difficult question to answer, however, to understand why the majority Turks are not willing to grant such rights to the Kurdish minority. I think it's easy to label it as some kind of racism or ethnic nationalism, but I think it's more complex than that. When we deconstruct the fears of the Turkish majority, we often come across fears of weakening of their own identity, of their own national identity here. And this, again, we also see in other regions of the world, in the Balkans, in Central and Eastern Europe as well here. Often majorities are afraid of losing certain rights and powers. And I think we are better at understanding the concerns and legitimate concerns of minority group mobilization, but we are much less advanced, I think, in understanding the fears and concerns of the majorities. Let me conclude in this my remarks by saying that I think the challenge in the future will be, since we are in so many parts of the world, we come across problems of democratic erosion, polarizing politics, populism, as well as very legitimate, serious mobilizations of ethnic and racial mobilization, minority mobilization. I think the major challenge will be for different political projects to reverse democratic erosion, and in this emerging cleavage of democracy versus autocracy in the world, a major challenge will be to bring together these two types of mobilizations, because it will not be easy to do. On one hand, there is one goal of reversing autocratization and rebuilding democratic institutions and appealing to the concerns, interests of majorities. On the other hand, the very legitimate minority mobilizations, and who inevitably see their own concerns downplayed by these greater, broader projects of democratic recovery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Murat. And now we turn the floor over to Pavitra, please.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity to join this really terrific panel of scholars. So I primarily study ethnic politics in India, but more recently, my research journey has involved bringing the US into a comparative perspective with India. So today I'm going to start by first focusing my remarks on how to understand political developments in India through a populist lens, and then talk a little bit about what, long-standing theories in ethnic politics, and including my own work in this area, can add to understanding how contemporary politics in India is unfolding, and where India might sit in relation to the US in terms of understanding what's going on. So first of all, you might know that the Bharatiya Janata Party, or the BJP, under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, came to power in 2014 in India after this historic win. And the party, despite, accumulating a relatively weak economic record and, developmentally, still came back even more resoundingly in 2019. After what many people thought would be a close election, it was nowhere close. And what makes the BJP's victory remarkable is that not that long ago, it was a relatively peripheral player in Indian politics. So, this has led to more recent scholarship, notably scholars like McDonnell and Cabrera, to argue that we need to adopt a populism analytical lens to understand the BJP. And why is that? Because, BJP in many ways seems to fit the classic ways in which a populist leader and the party emerges. First, under Modi, there's this idea of a very chaste and unsullied leader like Modi, who has been chosen to represent the pure people of India, which stands in to mean the Hindus versus, the corrupt, dynastic, secular, anti-national elites. And who are these authentic, pure people of India? They are Hindus, they're Jains, they're Buddhists, and those who ought to be tolerant of Hindus' claims to a spiritual homeland. And who are the anti-national elites? These are the corrupt Congress party, the Nehru-Gandhi family, media, NGOs, missionaries, academics, and even the press as they undertake any criticism of the government. And Narendra Modi's own life story as a backward caste outsider has been really used very effectively to portray him as this pure, chaste outsider who's transforming Indian politics. And what has that meant? It has meant that increasingly Prime Minister Modi has been able to remake institutions of all kinds into his own image. And importantly, the organized BJP party is now being seen as a vehicle for his leadership ambitions. Now, how do we connect ethnic politics to this lens of populism that scholars have advocated? Now, this is where I think the story is more complicated, but also more interesting, and one where parallels to the American case are apparent. So first, I think we should think of India, like the US, as a case of ethnic politics, of a ranked ethnic system, as Donald Horowitz advocates. Now, what is a ranked ethnic system? In these countries, there's a clear economic difference between ethnic or racial groups. Some ethnic groups are wealthy, others are poor, and India's caste system really reflects this economic difference to this day. So this has made a particular kind of political coalition possible. As the political power of lower castes grew in India through the 70s and 80s, the upper castes of India, like the American whites of today, grew increasingly aggrieved and found their social position in society as a high-ranked group to be no longer secure. So they have become a bedrock of support for the BJP under Modi, not unlike how we think about white support for Donald Trump's ambitions and office. For this particular group, the BJP is the party that understands the importance of social order, upper castes in political leadership, the segregation of upper castes in a whole range of arenas, including education, and the party's leadership to reflect this makeup. And this support base is very anti-redistributive because it fears not only redistribution from the state, it fears social integration. So even its poor members are much less supportive of a government's role in addressing economic inequality. This support group also gives BJP a really long rope to do whatever it wants to stay in power. Similar to the kinds of tactics Hakeem was describing earlier on, the carte blanche given to Republican elites to try and stay in power. And so in India, what this looks like is a support base that is very comfortable with the BJP's increasingly anti-institutionalist moves, such as weakening the bureaucracy, weakening the courts, weakening universities, and weakening the media. And beyond the upper caste support, the BJP has also very effectively used its Hindu-first anti-Muslim rhetoric to try and gain non-upper caste supporters. And additionally, the BJP pays very close attention to disaffection amongst lower castes at the local level, trying to create electoral alliances to win elections at a much more local level by addressing economic concerns of groups that don't traditionally support it. So one lesson the BJP's ethnic coalition holds for us is that ethnic or racial populisms can look very different within the same context or across contexts. So why do I say this? India has witnessed several types of populisms. Most notably, a kind of subnational populism that was once very much the way in which politics unfolded in states like Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh in the South. Here, The authentic people were the lower castes, the subalterns, and the upper castes were the corrupt elites. And this sort of populism led to a populism that was grounded in strong welfare policies, affirmative action, and served as a template for subaltern mobilization. But what the BJP has done is flipped that. Here, the aggrieved upper castes, like the aggrieved whites of the US, are the true people of India. And so the overlap of ethnic or racial rank and populism can generate very different coalitions, which have very different implications for policies and governing impulses of different groups. One might look fundamentally anti-democratic, like the case of the US or India, US with Donald Trump, or the case of India with BJP. But the other kind of populism might look like one where more access is being given to marginalized groups, even though both of these might have anti-institutional impulses. So if there's one takeaway that I want to leave with you all is to give nuance to what ethnicity looks like in different contexts and the role that ethnic rank or economic differences between groups can play in creating certain types of populisms in some places versus others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pavi, and for all of our panelists, thank you for these excellent remarks. We've heard a lot of sort of initial introductions to the shape that ethnic and racial politics takes, as well as the sort of state of democracy, not just recent cases of erosion, but also deeper stories about state formation and change over time, as well as continuity over time. So we have a lot of great material to start us off with the Q&A. So we're going to turn now to the Q&A portion of our panel. So just as a reminder, we'll ask any of our panelists who'd like to respond to any of the questions, keeping our discussion to each question to roughly 5 minutes. So I'll start off by asking the first question. And these questions we gathered from students in the Democratic Erosion Consortium from a variety of universities. So our first question was inspired by a question from Jared Reyes from George Washington University, which is, are there examples of political actors, either inside or outside the country that you study, that have exploited race or ethnic tensions or relations to further their anti-democratic agendas in the country or countries that you study? I'll open up the floor to anyone who'd like to respond.
Well, sure. Maybe the answer for all of us is yes. Certainly yes, in the US. And I won't belabor this point because I think the example is so clear and so obvious. And so I won't spend a lot of time there. Most recently, of course, we saw this throughout the presidency of Donald Trump, who exploited the grievances of white folks who believed that their position in society was becoming more precarious, that their hold on power, within formal and informal institutions was under attack. And we saw the consequences of exploiting that kind of perceived precarity on January the 6th, as I wrote in 538, that these folks who stormed the Capitol didn't come merely in defense of democracy or freedom or whatever. They came in defense of white supremacy. And so I think we saw that most notably during the presidency of Donald Trump here in the US, but this is a long through line in American history.
So I want to jump in and say, beyond attacks on democratic institutions, which is, of course, things like the vote, one place to look for action is also in institutions that actually deliver on the promise of democracy. So, a good functioning state. And so what you saw under Trump and what you're seeing under Modi is attacking institutions that are vital to good redistributive politics that, these groups fear. So the attack on the census, the attack on the postal services, the attack and defunding of the IRS are all part of weakening institutions beyond simply the vote. It is also to create an ineffective state if you were to lose power and the other groups gains that power, right? So one thing I would suggest is to look for more areas of institutional weakening than the very direct ones, which is storming of the Capitol and weakening the vote. to these other non-obvious areas, which are also important for democratic politics.
Maybe I would also add that, many of the autocratic political actors in the world today, they are good coalition builders. Maybe we shouldn't necessarily think that all attacks on democratic institutions are motivated or intended to appeal to certain ethnic or racial constituencies. They are quite good in marketing, political marketing. They may do things, say things to appeal to certain ethnic or racial constituencies, but then they have also other constituencies. They do things to satisfy them. I think there's not always a common thread that brings together the concerns of these different constituencies. But as far as these political actors are concerned, they are able to mobilize a winning majority by combining these different agendas that perhaps are not necessarily part of a common political ideology. But at the end, by appealing to different segments of society, they are able to mobilize a winning majority, and the result is, of course, democratic erosion.
I'll just add to the last 2 points, actually. It is really tempting to focus on the cases of very bright and stark language along racial lines that we've seen in some recent cases. But in the case of Colombia, when we look at the disproportionate impacts of the conflict over the past decade, it's pretty astounding to see how the conflict has disproportionately affected Black and Indigenous Colombians without really any language about Black or Indigenous people. And so, there's been no really kind of explicit racist appeal to, the damage that they do to the state. Of course, this happens at the micro level, but you can still kind of get these disproportionate impacts on the communities without the language.
I mean, I will say, just to echo Murat's point, ethnic politics can be more or less encompassing, right? So, I had Hakim's initial response, which is, who hasn't? But there are cases like, Nyeri in Tanzania, where politicians actively fought against ethnic divisions. And, even when you have, an ethnically diverse country, many political coalitions to build a majority have to span multiple ethnic groups, right? So one of the big questions in comparative politics is when will these cleavages, which sets of these cleavages will become salient? And then how is that? And I think really in Sub-Saharan Africa, the problem is one of permanent minorities. Though I'm intrigued by Murat's point about Hungary, where you have ethnic polarization with no demographic threat. That's a trickier one for me to think through. Anyway, thank you.
All right, thanks very much to everybody. Our next question comes from Taylor Earnhardt from Georgia State University, and that is, insofar as populism has posed a challenge to democracy in the country you study, has populist rhetoric targeted specific racial or ethnic groups?
I can say from the case of Panama and Colombia, actually, that it's not so much ethnic and racial, but it's national. So with the crisis emerging in Venezuela and over the years, and as migration out of Venezuela and into surrounding countries has increased, that we've seen very much an explicit rhetoric, xenophobic rhetoric that is anti-Venezuelan. And in the case of Panama particularly, it was quite striking that the party that kind of labels itself as the catch-all party of all groups has probably been the most explicit in the denigration of Venezuelan migrants. So this is an appeal at the grievances of local Panamanians who kind of see their informal businesses maybe threatened by the arrival of migrants from other places, and parties certainly are taking up this language.
I would just note, I'm sorry, go ahead, Noor.
Actually, I give an answer, but also maybe a follow-up question to everybody as well, that I think some of the populist politicians can be also quite flexible in creating moving targets. I think we saw this very clearly in the Turkish case when the incumbent incumbent Justice and Development Party, since it came to power, in order to maintain its support and again mobilize a winning majority, it has targeted discursively a very, very wide variety of different groups. It was first, the seculars, then it moved on to Alevis, and then it became the Kurds. But it had actually appealed to the Kurdish minority for a while before. But then it has targeted the Kurds. Populist politicians often target also foreigners and as well as the outside world. Starting from George Soros to U.S. imperialism or EU imperialism. So it can be quite flexible. I think there are quite astute politicians in creating these new discourses that constantly create a perception of a threat, and it doesn't always have a fixed target. And it would be interesting to see whether we see this same phenomenon, I think, in other countries as well.
Yeah, I was just going to note quickly that I found the work of my colleague Terry Moe on this topic quite compelling, thinking about the way that political elites like Donald Trump can exploit what ordinary folks read as an ineffective government. For example, I think consistent with some of the commentary made in light of the previous question that we'll recall, Marcus, I see the cat there. We'll recall, of course, that that Donald Trump frequently said to folks that I alone can fix it, right? Scapegoating racial and ethnic minorities, scapegoating immigrants and others as ways of explaining away the sort of great inequality that many Americans do have to confront. And so I think it's that kind of scapegoating of racial and ethnic minorities coupled with what is at times a rather ineffective government that gives this kind of ethno-nationalist populism that folks like Donald Trump traffic in its power.
So I want to just add that in the Indian case, the anti-Muslim rhetoric is very, very apparent, and it's really served as a rallying cry for the BJP as it goes into elections in different parts of the country, and the issues that it seeks to highlight, whether it's amending national citizenship laws, implementing, a ban of beef or the sale of cows for meat. I mean, it's all a part of a piece to try and single out who the people are that they mean with those policies, and that's Muslims, right? But the other thing I want to highlight is there's also this very blatant language now that's very upper caste that had sort of disappeared in Indian politics over the past 30 years, which has emerged. So there's no disguising now conferences where people say they're very proud to be Brahmins and that poor Brahmins are people that you should care about. Party leaders openly saying these sorts of things that, a decade ago would be considered impolite. So yes, there's a targeting, but there's also self-aggrandizing in a way that didn't happen in Indian politics over the last 30 years as it democratized. And now you see that overt language appear again, which has been interesting to watch. Yeah.
Thank you all. Our next question actually comes from several students from Fairleigh Dickinson and George Washington U. They all had a version of the next question, which is, do you have any thoughts in the contemporary moment on how the advent of social media has shaped the dynamics you've been describing in the country or countries you study?
Well, we can certainly more easily see in real time the sort of erosion of democracy in these various places. I think especially in the case of the US, which is the case that I know well. I mean, we've been talking a lot about democratic erosion as it relates to voting or maybe the ineffectiveness of institutions. But it might well be the case that in a liberal democracy, people, irrespective of their background, can exist safely in the presence of agents of the state. And so we've seen, I've been watching and following the trial of Derek Chauvin, the officer who murdered George Floyd, and we know that these events occur and the frequency with which they occur because of social media, because they are recorded. And so I think we just get a view in real time of the attacks on democracy thanks to social media. And of course, it's an organizing tool. We've seen the power of movements to organize via social media. Black Lives Matter, we'll recall, starts off as a sort of hashtag and becomes a sort of global movement. So I think in those two ways, bringing attention to and serving as an organizing platform have been really powerful means by which social media has played a role here.
So I'm reluctant to sort of one, jump in on something I don't know that much about, and two, disagree with Hakeem. But my intuition was the opposite, to be totally honest, that, you know, one thing that social media does is basically break up the social space and enable people to be further socially segregated by their social media networks. There's a student who's doing a PhD at Daystar University on Kenyan politics, who's studying how social media facilitates basically ethnic hate speech, right? Mm-hmm. Those platforms and normalizes it, right? Because if you're on social media platforms where other people are using hate speech, then that becomes like, oh, that's what people do, right? And then the other thing that's really interesting that Hakeem said that I think, you know, an Africanist might answer differently, or a person from another country might answer differently, is the state's ability to control social media, to control access to social media, right? Which you know countries are increasingly doing now. For example, Zambia, but we also see cases where there are media shutdowns, right, or shutdowns of the internet in response to activism. So yeah, so it's a tricky one to figure out. I mean, I don't think there's a clear consensus answer on this one.
I see all of these as friendly amendments. I heard no real disagreement there, Kamuli.
So I think for India, you know, there's a couple of very cool scholars working on this. I want to highlight their work. There's Simone Choshad at Leiden University and Sumitra Badrinathan, who's just completed her PhD at Penn. And both of these scholars are really trying to understand the role social media, particularly things like WhatsApp misinformation campaigns, have done for currying party favor, and who is even sympathetic to fake news and who isn't. And the secondary question, who is then persuaded to come back and listen to you know, the fact that what you're reading is misinformation? Who can be persuaded to change their mind? And they're finding these things break down in different ways by partisanship. So those who are in favor of the BJP, the dominant party right now, are much less likely to be persuaded that what they got was misinformation. And so I think there's interesting ways in which misinformation is interacting with identity and partisan polarization in India. So, you know, there's good news and bad news in that it's an basis for organizing for a lot of subaltern groups. But then on the other hand, it's also a basis for hate speech in India, and different people seem to be persuaded differently by the same channel. Yeah.
I think, you know, there is also a simple answer and more difficult, more complex answer to this question. On one hand, if, you know, from an historical perspective, what we experience today is not so different from what people in early 20th century experienced when the mass newspapers really became more widespread. People were very afraid that radical speech, hate speech will be aggrandized by this new medium, and it did. But at the end, people also learned to cope with it. we see a similar situation today. I think autocrats so far have been better at manipulating social media in order to push forward their agenda, but Democrats are also learning. On the other hand, the more complex, perhaps worrisome development is it's surveillance capitalism. It's of course, it's quite hard to foresee the consequences of new technologies today as and the development of surveillance capitalism, because it really threatens perhaps the most basic requirement of democracy, which is the human agency and the autonomy of human preferences. So if it threatens, if technology can target our own preferences, and if you cannot even be sure whether our fears or even desires sometimes are our own, or have they been manipulated? Have they been really served to us by manipulating information? Then it becomes really dangerous for democracy and hard to foresee.
Okay, let's go on to another question. And this question is various versions of it asked by several students, Elise Gaitan, Keisha Patel, Emmeline Stoddard, all from Fairleigh Dickinson University, but we've had some other questions come in which are quite similar. And that is sort of going back a little bit to one of Hakeem's initial questions at the end about what do we do in resistance. And the questions are, given the piecemeal and subtle character of democratic erosion, when should we be concerned, and when should we act? How should we act? How do we distinguish between what is a threat to democracy as an institution and what are simply fights over ideological preferences that may differ?
That is an incredibly difficult question, because one wants to say always, everyone, all the time, but that's just not how people. That's not possible, right? And authoritarians or people or wannabe authoritarians know this, and then craft the forms of the institutional changes that they make in ways that make it very, very clear that, or make it very, very difficult to know when the truly terrible thing has happened, right? Things like, stolen elections, research has shown that things like that sometimes can help people resolve this coordination problem around which violations of democracy are the ones that we have to now enter the streets for. But it's a big part of being a dictator is obscuring how unhappy unhappy people are, using things like propaganda, divide and rule tactics. If I had an answer to that question, I would not be here right now.
I think this incremental nature of democratic erosion or autocratization poses really big challenges to Democrats. But I think the challenges are different at early stages and at advanced stages. I think at early stages of democratic erosion, since the erosion is incremental and small, each change is small, it's relatively easier for institutions to deal with them and maybe to stop them. But on the other hand, because these developments are not very serious, democratic erosion is not very serious, institutions and people who want to save democracy may not be sufficiently alarmed. They will not take it seriously enough. But we are learning. I think the more we talk about it and the more we learn about democratic erosions in the world, I think people also become more aware of its dangers. At more advanced stages, I think the real challenge is to overcome lack of self-confidence as far as the democratic forces in a country are concerned, because the incremental nature of democratic erosion provides many opportunities for democratic oppositions to reverse autocratization. But if they fail in this, then the disappointment that comes with it also becomes greater, because you have failed so many times. If there is one coup that kills democracy, okay, you failed once. If autocratization occurs incrementally and then you have failed many times at each step, then I think the psychological impact on society becomes graver. And then that becomes the major challenge for democratic oppositions to meet, to overcome that lack of self-confidence and hopelessness, perhaps. And in relation to our subject today, I think more often than not, in places like Malaysia, Turkey, and others, I think democratic oppositions have to find ways to unite a winning majority to a democratic coalition to reverse autocratization. But that democratic coalition is often divided ethnically or racially. There are different ethnic racial groups that are potential part of this democratic coalition. And it's hard to find a common discourse, a common agenda that can unite them under a democratizing agenda.
Yeah, and I would, I think I heard in part of that question, kind of like what to do, given that we have this erosion. And, one of the things that I think both connects what we're seeing with social movements in Latin America and also what we're seeing in the US as well is this kind of split approach that social movements or social groups are taking towards continuing to make requests of the state, but also recognizing that community mobilization has to happen outside of those channels of formal democratic responsiveness. And so, a perfect example would be that, there was extreme mobilization around the 2020 election for, people to go out and to vote because it mattered. But also, kind of within this air of a little bit of dissatisfaction among the Democratic camp of who the candidates were, at least among some sections of social movement groups, kind of looking to mobilize around more radical change. In Colombia, we see kind of similar things where the state has made promise after promise after promise to restore people's rights to land, to redress displacement and the like. And the demands are still made. The laws exist, and so people are mobilizing through the state to make sure that those laws are completed. But at the same time, recognizing that community safety is going to come from communities themselves. And so it's kind of this undefined path forward between, both continuing to petition the state, but also kind of building insular and communal levels of autonomy and self-determination, which is, I think, it perhaps may even sidestep some of the more traditional democratic institutions that we kind of consider as the problem solvers when democracy is at threat.
Yeah, I'm a political psychologist, so I understand, I think, a little bit about the capacity of people to be pissed off about a lot of things, and that capacity is limited. People have a lot of things to attend to, and it is in part the job of political elites to frame these issues in ways that galvanize small d Democrats. And I think in the US, the sort of effectiveness of that is it ebbs and flows. And so one of the things that's perhaps rather striking is that even as these very vivid attacks on democracy take hold, you see folks like Raphael Warnock and others speaking with just such clarity about these issues. But you'd expect, I think, to see more. And I think that's something that perhaps this moment of urgency will lead to a bit more of. But it is the job of political elites to frame these issues in such a way that they energize a set of emotions that we know are mobilizing ones. And we saw some of that happen in 2020, and perhaps hopefully we see more of that happening now. I'll just note that there are a lot of groups on the ground in these places doing this hard work. And so if I could give some tangible advice, it would be to find ways to connect with and to support those who are doing the hard work of safeguarding democracy instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, join up with those who understand their area and who've been doing the work in the space for some time.
Thank you all. We have time for one final question, and we're invoking moderator's privilege here and asking our own question. We also have a question from an audience member that is sort of related, so I'll ask that as well, which is particularly focused on the US, which I know is a case that's on a lot of our minds, right? So the question is, have you seen any success stories, right? So we've been talking about like, when should we mobilize? How should we mobilize? How hard it is to know when and what to do. Have you seen any success stories of reducing polarization, particularly in the countries that you study? And what do you think are the right steps or policies to decrease polarization and hyperpartisanship? And the kind of related question, particularly for Hakeem, comes actually from Steve Levitsky, who writes about these issues and who some of us in the consortium, you all have read his work. The question is, thinking about how to save multiracial democracy in America, we seem tragically to be trapped by our own institutions. Arguably a solid, if not massive majority in the US is open to the basic pillars of multiracial democracy, but our electoral rules and counter-majoritarian institutions may well keep that majority from winning and exercising power until it's too late. Constitutional reform is obviously very difficult. What then is your view on the way out? That's a big.
Steve can answer this question. I mean, it's hard. It's really hard. As Steve more than anybody knows, this is really a hard question. I think I am heartened by the fact that when we poll on these issues, the vast majority of Americans support the kinds of reforms, for example, that are in the For the People Act. They support money out of politics. They support making it easier to vote. And I think that public opinion will matter. I mean, there was just reporting in the New Yorker that these folks who fundraise for Republican priorities are worried. They're afraid that the majority even of their voters support these pro-democracy efforts. And so I think the job is for all of us as small d Democrats to go out and sing the praises of democracy, to showcase to these folks that that their co-partisans are engaged in efforts that are anti-democratic. And Steve is right. The nature of our institutions makes all of this harder to do. But I still think that members of Congress are single-minded seekers of re-election. And this is a sort of anti-democratic effort that they're undertaking. And so our job, I think, is to make it clear, even to their constituents, that what they're doing is anti-democratic and runs afoul of their own priorities. So that's not a good answer, I'm sure. It's a hard problem, but I think it starts with highlighting the urgency of the problem for everyday folk.
So for India, I would point to two areas of hope. So the first is subnational politics in India, and the state of Tamil Nadu is one that is very close to my heart. And this is a state that has kept the BJP out of its politics entirely. And it's a state which has two strong local subnational parties, the DMK and the AIA-DMK. And what repeatedly resonates with the voters of Tamil Nadu is a very strong focus on, delivering on policies. So strong welfarist schemes, strong notions of, governance. And it's not that these states have no problems, right? So Tamil Nadu has long histories of corruption, dynasty, everything that you might imagine typical developing country politics to look like. But whether it's the DMK or the AIA-DMK, there's a strong commitment to retaining, core sort of deliverables within the state. So what India needs right now is a cohesive opposition to BJP to make those same kinds of appeals to the population, which is missing now. It's sort of like an opposition in disarray, which doesn't have a clear counter narrative to the BJP story. So if there's any hope, I think we can look to thinking about subnational politics as making a sort of national appeal to counter the weight of BJP, which is so focused on its ethnic appeals within the country.
I think there are different problems that we are talking about in regard to ethnic politics. In many parts of the world, the ethnic groups demand some kind of self-government. This is an old story that we know, that has existed for a long time. And there are many success stories there. I think over time, nation states have learned to address these concerns by means of very different kinds of devolution. And it is possible to accommodate these ethnic group demands by providing different degrees of regional cultural autonomy and by sharing power. So in that sense, I think, and there are many settlements as well, so in that sense, I think there are many success stories. Now then, there is another problem that we're talking about here is cases of autocratization, democratic erosion, when some kind of an incumbent party, partly by using ethnic, racial fears and politics, gains power and then begins to erode democratic institutions. And we see this autocratization process. This is, I feel, quite new. I think, for example, theories of democratic transition that were developed during 1990s, 1980s, don't actually necessarily provide us answers how we can deal with these kind of problems of incremental autocratization. And societies are learning. I think there are problems like how to create a synergy between social movements, civil society, and political parties. Political parties are no longer strong. They cannot lead these democratic mobilizations to reverse autocratization. So then we need to find new types of organization. So this is one challenge. There are some success stories. I think political parties as well as civil societies are learning. Maybe I can think of, in addition to subnational politics, which is very important, I think many parts of the world, democratic oppositions first winning victories in local politics, regional governments, and using it as a springboard to gain success in national level politics. But cases like Hungary and Turkey, that in both cases, oppositions have found new strategies to join forces and build democratic coalitions. They do in local level politics, they nominate joint candidates and they try to create a common democratic program. And so far in local politics, they have been successful in places like Istanbul and Budapest. But to use this experience, to translate this experience into success in national politics is difficult, I think. And I think in this respect, democratic oppositions are in a process of learning, I think.
And just very briefly, I would say that I take hope from the fact that even though there's backlash in response to many of these reforms to increase representation in Latin America, that the legal framework is there. It exists. Those laws have not been repealed, which creates, I think, steps for groups to kind of do jiu-jitsu in response to democratic or erosion.
Well, unfortunately, our time is drawn to a close. There are many open questions remaining, but it's been very illuminating. At least I can say so personally, and I know on behalf of my students. I'd like to thank you on behalf of Emily and myself as moderators for participating in it was a really wonderful discussion. And I'll now turn it over to Rob for some closing remarks. Thank you very much.
Yeah, just very briefly, I want to echo John's comment and thank all of our panelists. This was really incredibly provocative and thought-provoking, and it was so wonderful to have this comparative perspective. I think a lot of us are are thinking a lot about democracy in the US as we watch sort of what's going on around us. And obviously to think about that from a purely American perspective is very informative, but to have all these different perspectives at once was really just refreshing and eye-opening. So thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to everyone who joined us in the audience and for the thoughtful questions that you asked as well. And thank you also to the media services folks at Brown, without whom this definitely would have fallen apart at the very beginning. So thank you for your help. Thank you, John and Emily, for co-moderating. For those of you who would like to have an encore performance, this will go up on the the Watson Institute's YouTube page sometime in the next couple of weeks. So I'll tweet that out when it's available. Thank you all very much, and yeah, let's save our democracies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Okay, well,
Okay.
I don't know how it compares to previous roundtables, but it seemed to be okay.
Are we
Kyle,
still
are we
live?
still live? Possibly.